Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode on the show, Control or Be Controlled, a podcast designed to help you start thinking differently and take control of your life. Today's guest is Clifford Clifford Brown, a former Beverly Hills commercial law partner who walked away from a high-power legal career and a dream home overlooking the ocean to spend the next 27 years working in international development and foreign aid. Clifford, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Darlington. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so you left a successful law career and a comfortable life in Beverly Hills to work in foreign aid. What motivated that decision, and did you ever question it afterward?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. Of course, I did look for many years. Uh, I walked away from. I had arrived at what some people would have thought was the professional priesthood of the American business community. But when I was in high school and college, I had been on a debate team, two different debate teams that talked about the subject of economic development overseas and specifically the U.S. foreign aid program. And after college, I was lucky enough to win a fellowship to go down to Latin America for a year and travel on a program of self study. Well, I ended up in Chile living with, I had a cousin who had been in the Peace Corps there, and I had met him a couple of years earlier. I had dropped out of college for a year and I worked on a ship, an oceanographic ship. I started as a dishwasher and then I became a typist in the ship's office. And when it got to Valparaiso, Chile, the officers came and said, Cliff, your cousin's at the gangway. Well, I didn't know this guy. I, my mother knew that my ship was going there, and she knew his mother and knew that he was in the Peace Corps there. Well, I never met the guy, but I said, I don't have a cousin here. And they said, well, he looks like you, sounds like you. So I went out to the ship's gangway, and sure enough, there's this tall American guy there standing next to a Chilean woman who was his fiancee. It turns out he was my cousin, um, several years later, when I won this fellowship, the only person I knew down in South America was my cousin's father-in-law. By then, he had married that woman, and they moved back to the States. But the father-in-law was still down there, so I wrote him, and he said, "Yeah, come on down." And I spent most of that year in Chile, and I learned Spanish pretty well because the guy I lived with didn't speak. I had studied it in college, and he didn't speak any English, and his housekeeper didn't speak English. So by the end of the year, I was fairly fluent in Spanish. So I'm skipping a lot of the story here, but I ended up going to law school after that fellowship year, and then I stayed in LA. And at the time, I've been married twice, and I had two families. Well, after 12 years in commercial law, which was very educational to me, but it really wasn't where my heart was. I wanted to use my Spanish in my job, and I couldn't do that doing commercial bankruptcy work, which is what I was doing at the time. And I was young enough and foolish enough to think, well, I've got enough money now. I can go do something that might be more fun. And I saw an ad in the Wall Street Journal. They wanted an agency I'd never heard of, USAID, wanted attorneys that were willing to go overseas that had another language. And I said, well, that's me. And so I flew back to DC and I interviewed with them. And they had a big map on the wall and little red pins all over the map. And I said, what are those pins? He says, that's where our attorneys are. And something in me turned over and said, I got to have this job. I had to go back and explain it to my wife, who was also a practicing attorney, but she said, well, you go and try it out. If you like it, maybe we and the kids will come. And they did. We ended up in Nairobi, which is not a place I could use my Spanish, but eventually I got back to Latin America and I made it come true. But yeah, I look back for many years wondering if it had been the right decision. Um, but on balance, yes, it was. I had a phenomenal experience in the Foreign Service and was able to live in 7 different countries. Then they sent me back to school to learn first Russian and then French. So by the end of my career, I was professionally fluent in those 3 languages. And when you learn another language, it's like you've grown another soul. And I didn't make up that quote. That's Charlemagne said that in the Middle Ages. But I think he was right. When you start speaking another language, you feel like a different person. And it was a very broadening experience. So I didn't regret leaving commercial law. Um, but yeah, I look back at it often and wondered if it had been the right decision. And then, of course, when I got remarried, I got 3 more kids, so I could use some of that income now. But they're okay. That's the short version.
All right. Thank you so much. So, uh, moving on, coming from the private sector, what was your first major shock or adjustment when you entered government work?
Well, at first it was I couldn't believe they were paying me for such useless activities. And they sent us to something called the New Entry Orientation class, which for 6 weeks we sat around and got exposed. They would bring people by to speak to us about different parts of our agency. I mean, it was useful to learn, but boy, something like that would never have happened in my law firm anyway. We were a small group. We had to get down to business right away and produce. But in the government, they've got time to do these long training programs for people, and I thought that was at first kind of amazing, and then the scope of the agency's work kind of blew me away. They brought us, and I give one example in a book that I wrote called Dilettante. Well, I can tell you later why I chose that title, but um, they brought us into a room that looks like something out of a James Bond movie, and they had these TV screens all around the side of the room, and this was the control center for the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. And then the first thing they did was present a weather report of the major storm system going around the world, all around the world. And I thought, my gosh, this job, these people think that we're so important that we need to know what the weather is everywhere. and I, nothing like that would have ever happened in my law firm. Um, and I was just blown away by the scope of the agency's responsibilities, and they took it very seriously. But after 6 weeks, most of the work really started after that program. But at first, I was just blown away by the luxury of being able to sit there and not do any useful activity for them other than be trained. That was a surprise to me.
Okay, so you have said foreign aid reflects our better angels. What do you mean by that? And do you still believe it holds it holds true today?
Absolutely. I think that foreign aid. There's an interesting history to it, and I'm reading more about it now that I'm out of the agency. I wish that I'd had the background about the foreign aid, the history of foreign aid, but the idea that countries would start to be concerned about economic development in other countries and that the government of a given country should try to do something about that is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, if you look back in history, there was nothing like that really before the, the 20th century. There are a few examples that you can find where countries reached out to respond to natural disasters or other events in other countries, but the idea that one country should try to assist another to develop more economically or to say fight poverty or to improve public health, that sort of thing was very, very new. And in 1961, uh, we created this agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development. We had some precedents for it right after World War II. We assisted in the development or the rebuilding of Europe, and we did the same thing in Japan, and also We assisted in Taiwan and in South Korea, but the idea that we would set up an agency whose sole purpose is to, bring in advisors and material goods if needed to help another country fight poverty or improve governance, or there's a whole host of objectives that we ended up, you know, using to guide our program. But it's a fairly new phenomenon, and I look upon this now as evidence that there was an ancient Chinese philosopher named Mencius who said that there's goodness inside everybody, and his evidence for that was that there's no adult on the planet, if they look and they see a child that's about to fall into a well, that adult will try to go over and prevent that child from falling in the well. And it doesn't matter what nationality that child has. That's just a natural part of being human. And I think foreign aid is evidence that we all feel it. And, it, the United Nations was set up to do, in part, some of that work. And they have their own development agency, the UN Development Agency, UNDC. I guess it's United Nations Development Corporation, or I don't know what the C stands for, but it's a new phenomenon, but I think it's part of the better angels of humanity. And in my old age now, I'll be 77 in a couple of weeks. I have come to the conclusion that we're all pretty much alike, regardless of nationality. I've lived in 9 different countries if you include this one, and I've learned several languages. When I didn't say I was in Nairobi for 3.5 years, and I learned Swahili there. And I've studied several languages beyond French, Russian, and Spanish. So I have come to the conclusion that we're all pretty much alike. And these national borders that we have, frankly, are more of a habit now, an historical habit and an anachronism left over from the times when they were first created, which, if you get back to the original purpose of borders, it was selfishness. It was people who wanted to keep other people away from their land and their possessions. And that concept has, just as once upon a time monarchy was a habit, and in our own history, there was a very influential piece of writing called Common Sense by an Englishman named Thomas Paine. And he made that point. He said, there's nothing divine about the rights of kings. It's simply a habit that people have hung on to. And now I think it's the same with national borders. Foreign aid is one way to try and bridge the barriers that those borders present, but I definitely still think that it's part of our better angels, and I wish those borders could go away, put it that way. And there's another reason for that, which is that when you have extremely large territories surrounded by one national border, then you end up with very large militaries that, in a practical sense, can respond to the whims of a single individual. And we're seeing that today. We're seeing that in Ukraine. We're seeing that in Iran. We may see it someday in Taiwan. And the idea that on a planet with 7 billion people, you have 2 or 3 people who can make decisions that will affect all of humanity is, to my mind, insane. And but that's my current shtick, if it rings any bells.
All right, so looking across your 27 years with USAID, did foreign aid ultimately work? What does working even mean in that context?
It does work in the right circumstances. It it failed to work in. I give 2 examples in the book. We haven't mentioned the fact that I've published this book called Inside USAID, an Odyssey of Foreign Assistance. And the reason I did it, I was offended last year when our government destroyed it, alleging that we were corrupt. They had no evidence for that. It was insane. It was a political stunt. But the the circumstances where it doesn't work is when a recipient government doesn't want it. For instance, in the former Soviet Union, if we went in there trying to promote democracy and free speech in an area where there was an authoritarian government that did not want to, permit opposition or widespread criticism of their own administration, we were bound to fail. If we tried to prevent or convince farmers in remote parts of Latin America or Afghanistan not to grow illegal drugs, that was a failure because the demand is really the problem, not the supply. So, but in other areas, it was very successful. And the success stories abound. I mean, South Korea itself, Taiwan, those are major success stories. Costa Rica, major success story. We created entire industries. I give one example in the book where we brought in a company in Central America to teach some farmers up in the mountains of Honduras to grow onions, and we shipped a container to Miami, and they were experimenting to find out if those onions could be sold in the U.S. because they didn't look like the normal kind that people were buying in the stores here. And it was also, they were coming at a time when onions were not in season here. And 10 years later, 500,000 people in Honduras are making their living growing onions. And we started that. And we did the same thing with snow peas in Guatemala, with melons and cantaloupes and shrimp farms and flowers in Costa Rica and Colombia. We have created entire industries, and it's because we were willing to experiment and bring in implementers who could, dedicate some funds to proving that a given objective could be achieved in the commercial sense. And in many places, the range of activities we engaged in was really the reason I called my first book Dilettante, because in a sense that's what I felt I was. I was a lawyer initially at the agency, and I had to know the foreign aid law and the procurement rules, but I got at the same time to dabble in hundreds of other areas that just span the whole range of human activity. So yes, for the most part, it
All right,
worked.
go on.
Well, that's when it was successful in the circumstances where the host government wanted the help, appreciated the help, and did not try to block it. But if they didn't want the help, then it was certainly not useful.
All right, so you have mentioned bureaucratic constraints inside aid organizations. What were some of the most frustrating or surprising limitations you encountered?
Well, the biggest frustration was high level corruption. I tell the story. I was speaking out about corruption in the energy sector in Kyrgyzstan. It's very, very easy to smuggle electricity. And Kyrgyzstan and the various stands that were created after 1991 when the former Soviet Union fell apart. Kyrgyzstan is a mountainous area and they have major hydroelectricity plants, but in the Soviet times, that electricity was used everywhere within the Soviet Union. But when the borders were created, then these areas became independent countries, and that's a separate story. They didn't seek it, they didn't want it, and didn't expect it. But the subsidies ended, and all of a sudden they find themselves independent. And a lot of electricity was simply being sold north under the table. And the Kyrgyz were suffering blackouts despite the fact that they had high level high levels of electricity production, but it was all being sold to buyers in Russia and Kazakhstan. And I was speaking out about it. And my own wife was, when I revealed that I had married a Kyrgyz woman, she was my Russian tutor, and she still is. And we've been together for over 20 years now. But um, uh, she was abducted, and it was an effort to get me out of the country because I was speaking out too much about high level corruption. I would say the same thing in places like the former Zaire. I was there when Mobutu failed to pay his own army, and they rioted inside inside Kinshasa. We saw high level corruption in many places, and that was always a very uh, major barrier to any kind of success. We had a project in Zambia to rebuild a road between Kafue and Lusaka, and we had a pre-bidders conference. We were asking local companies or African companies to build the road, but to give us bids. And we had a bidders conference. I think it was in Botswana, and we got a complaint that one of the contractors said there's these guys here that are promising that we'll get the contract, but only if we send 3% of the price up to the guy's cousin in London. And so we sent a fellow down there to record the conversation, pretend he was a bidder, and he got it all on tape. And sure enough, there was somebody from the ministry of that was going to be responsible for the contract using our funding, and they were offering to steer the contract to whichever company was going to give the right kind of bribe to the fellow's relatives up in London. And we just terminated the project. But when we brought it to the attention of the government, they didn't do anything about it. So we figured, well, then the minister must be in on it too. So that was frustrating when you find that high level people are on the take. It doesn't do the foreign aid program any good.
All right, here is my final question for you. Is there one question you wish I would have asked you that I did not ask you?
uh, well, I think you asked very good questions. I can't think of one right now. If you wanted to know more about certain topics like sex trafficking in West Africa or body parts trafficking, I could talk at length about some of those stories that I deal with in the book. But if people want to read or know more about me or my program, I have a website, but it's not my name alone. It's cliffordhbrown.com. And the reason for that is there's another Clifford Brown who's way more famous than me, and he was a black trumpet player in the 1950s, but he played a lot of jazz trumpet, and he's well known. So if you go on the internet and you search for Clifford Brown, you're going to get a picture of somebody who's not me playing a trumpet. So it's cliffordhbrown.com, and there you can see both of the books that I mentioned in this podcast, and also the links to some of my writings. I have a Substack that's Clifford Brown, all one word, without the H. The H stands for Harris, by the way. cliffordbrown.substack.com, and I write about various things there, including my concepts of my ideas about national borders and why I think they are historical anachronisms. So I thank you for the opportunity to at least share my platform with your listeners. Uh, I think spreading ideas is the most important thing we can do these days, and podcasts like yours are doing exactly that. So thank you.
All right, Clifford, thank you so much, and do have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.